Good morning and welcome to Scripture and Sermon from St. Paul's United Church of Christ, located in Watervliet, Michigan. My name is Pastor Dani Veenstra, and today our scripture comes to us from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, verses 31 through 38. And the sermon is called Plainly Said. And this text comes to us and shortly after we see that Jesus has fed thousands of people on a hillside. And then he heals a blind man by taking him by the hand and spitting and putting spit on his eyes. And he says to the man, "Can you see?" And the man says, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes again, and the man was able to see. So his fame is spreading, and stories about his teaching and his healing and feeding people, it's got the crowd excited. And then Jesus asks the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still other people say you're one of the prophets." Then he said, "What about you? Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Christ." Then we have today's scripture, chapter 8 of the Gospel called Mark, verses 31 through 38. Then Jesus began to teach his disciples, "The human one must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and the legal experts, and be killed, and then after 3 days rise from the dead." He said this plainly, but Peter took hold of Jesus and, scolding him, began to correct him. Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, then sternly corrected Peter. "Get behind me, Satan. You are not thinking God's thoughts, but human thoughts." After calling the crowd together with his disciples, Jesus said to them, "All who want to come after me must say no to themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. All who want to save their lives will lose them, and all who lose their lives because of me and because of the good news will save them. Why would people gain the whole world but lose their lives? What will people give in exchange for their lives? Whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this unfaithful and sinful generation, the human one will be ashamed of that person when he comes in the Father's glory with the holy angels." So as I said, Mark's gospel just before this has said that Jesus fed thousands of people. He healed a blind man by putting spit on his eyes, and then he asked the disciple, "Who do people say that I am?" We should try to put ourselves in the crowd that day. The disciples and the crowd are following Jesus like he's a local celebrity. They're basking in his wake. They're learning about liberation from oppression. They're watching him heal people, eating the food that he mysteriously produces. The disciples, I'm sure, are especially proud of their role. "I got to hold his cloak. Well, I'm the one that brought him lunch yesterday. I found a place for him to sleep last night." They must think that this gravy train, this wonderful thing they're doing, is going to go on forever, because they see in Jesus the fulfillment of some of their Jewish teachings and their Hebrew scriptures. In the book of Daniel, they would have known this passage. "As I watched in the night visions, I saw one like a human being coming with the clouds of heaven. And he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. To him was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all people Nations and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away. So the disciples see in Jesus this promised person, this promised human one. His dominion is everlasting. Glory and kingship that all people should serve him. This is their guy, the guy they're working with. Yet here is Jesus saying dreadful things. Things about suffering and death, and not just death, but that he'll be killed. And this is just after their conversation about identity when Jesus says, "Who do people say I am? Elijah? John the Baptist?" And then Jesus pushed the disciples to answer, "Who do you, my followers, say that I am?" And they answer like good groupies. "You're the Messiah, the anointed one, the one we read about in Daniel." After all, Jesus calls himself the human one. So yes, like the one in Daniel. But Jesus on this day tells them plainly, there's more to the story. The human one must suffer and be killed, and then be raised from the dead after 3 days. To us, this Easter prequel, we know the end of the story. We hear this year after year. We've grown up knowing that the killing of Jesus is not the end. The news of suffering and death, it's a given. It's no surprise to us. But when Jesus says, "I'm going to be killed, but wait, I'll be back 3 days and I'll be back," we're not surprised. But I ask you to imagine standing there that day, hearing this news for the first time. Your teacher, your healer, your friend, your companion is going to be killed. And all these disciples can hear in this story is failure. All of our work, all of our ministry, all the healing that's happened, all the people that have been fed. Jesus, you're talking weakness. You're talking failure. They can't take the news in. So Jesus actually repeats the same horrible news 2 more times in the Gospel of Mark. In chapter 9, he says, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands. They will kill him. 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." They didn't understand him that time either, and they were afraid to ask any questions. They didn't understand and afraid. They turned the conversation into an argument about who among them was the greatest. Then a 3rd time, Jesus tells them the truth. This time, they actually ask Jesus to save them a good seat when he gets to glory. Talk about denial. Jesus is telling them his death is necessary. But we have to know that the message of God's kingdom will not be understood if we think of the cause, if we think of Jesus' death as required. The cause needs to be advanced for justice and mercy against the systems of oppression, but that can't happen without Jesus' death. So his death is necessary, not causal, not required by God for the world to be saved. Not required, but needed in order to plainly say God's reign over oppressive systems will prevail. I want to repeat that last bit. Jesus' death is necessary, but not causal or required. His death is not required by God for the world to be saved, but needed. in order for the kingdom to plainly say God reigns, oppressive systems cannot prevail. But we know that the world will not pay attention to this man who is teaching and healing unless something dramatic happens. He'll fade, I think, into obscurity without this horrible ending and the mystery of the empty tomb. His death was needed to change the ways of the world. A message had to be sent to the world. God reigns. And sometimes when you follow God's ways over the ways of the world, Jesus was saying you too will suffer. Or at least you will need to lose your very self. Maybe not your physical life, but your egocentric, worldly psyche is the Greek word that was used. You must lose your psyche, your life force, yourself, if you are to follow Jesus and live out the message of the Hebrew Scriptures to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, and your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. To do that with your whole self, your whole life, requires a death to self, a death to the ways of the world, a death to everything you think is important. A reversal of ideas, of putting others first above all things. Jesus spoke very plainly that day, but they did not understand. He spoke plainly 2 more times, and they still didn't understand who he was, what his ministry meant for the world. They did not understand that he did it all for love, and that he expected them to do the same. He did it all for love, and he expects us to do the same. But those disciples were confused and frightened, and that when push came to shove and Jesus was arrested, they ran away. Jesus expected them to be willing to let go of their self-importance, their identity, immerse themselves in union with the human one. Jesus expects no less from us. Death of self is hard. We like our worldly possessions, our thoughts, our plans, our ways. But Jesus plainly said it that day and twice more, let go of your ego, your need to be first, your need to control how your future goes. Now I know for many of us as we age, letting go is not a choice when it comes to our physical being. Our bodies begin to fail us, and we have to rely on others. But we can decide that our hearts can forever and always belong to the human one, belong to his kingdom where all are cared for and valued, no matter who they are, who they love, how they worship. All are healed as only God can heal at the heart level where love resides. Let go of your life, your psyche, your life force, your ego. Let Jesus' way of love fill the places that are now empty, where ego no longer rules. Follow on to death itself, death of self, necessary, not the cause of the world being changed. Jesus' death was not required by God, but needed in order to plainly say, God reigns. Oppressive systems cannot prevail. Jesus said, let go of yourself, take up your cross. I noticed, or it hit me new this week, that phrase, take up your cross. Jesus did not say, take up my cross. meaning serve the Lord exactly like I do, he said, take up your cross. So I challenge you to figure out, what does your cross look like? Let go of your psyche, yourself, and figure out what your cross looks like. Figure out how God needs you to empty yourself in order to serve the kingdom, to share the message that God reigns. Love wins. Oppressive systems do not prevail. The message is more important than life itself. God's kingdom is coming. Your sacrifices make it so. Jesus said, take up your cross, follow me. Follow me, lose yourself, and live. May you figure out what your cross looks like. May you take it up. May you follow Jesus. May you lose yourself and live.